Yes. PJ, is it okay to kick things off?
Yep, I was about to get started. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, we're at the 5-minute mark. I'll keep mashing admit all as people arrive. But hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in to Housing Policy is Climate Policy. For anyone who doesn't already familiar with us, we're a Better Cambridge. We're an all-volunteer organization looking to address the housing crisis in Cambridge. So if after this you're feeling really inspired to fight climate change and try to fix the housing crisis, absolutely reach out to us. We'd love to get you involved. Today, we've got the privilege of hosting Anna Zetkulic. She's a senior associate at the Rocky Mountain Institute, and she works in their Urban Transformation Program. She researches basically how land use reform and housing policy can be used as tools to combat climate change. And then additionally, she does a ton of other fascinating work outside the US, trying to find ways to reduce energy use and vehicle miles traveled in order to lower everybody's climate footprints. Moreover, as Anna is mentioning in the first part of this, she spent a little bit of time in Cambridge as well, so she knows how lucky we are to live here and how wonderful a city we have. So she's going to give a little short presentation, and then she and her colleague Zack Subin, who's also on video up here, is also going to answer some questions that everybody has afterwards. So Anna, feel free to take it over and give us your presentation.
Thank you, PJ. And I just want to acknowledge one other colleague on the call, Ben Holland, who, along with Zack and myself, we're just like a very small piece of a much bigger team, but looking to stand up work that articulates that land use planning is a climate action tool. And like the title suggests, we believe that cities in the US, but not just city scale, states, metropolitan planning organizations, county agencies, community organizations have a very powerful tool in the toolbox when it comes to looking at their land use codes, how they invest in their cities in terms of transportation for climate action, and not just climate action, the multiple social benefits. Just to feed off, and anybody who's trickling in, the presentation is going to go across multiple aspects of RMI research. We'd love for this to be a discussion as much as it is a download, because we are a research institute and looking for feedback on organizations in the housing advocacy space, clean mobility space. Tell us what tools, what data points, what's missing to help you as advocates in having a stronger coalition and policies. So at any point in time you want to interrupt me during this presentation, I fully welcome it. And we can have this be a conversation. So just to give a bit of information on what Rocky Mountain Institute is and where this research came from, talking about housing policy as climate policy, PJ had mentioned that I'm in a program with an RMI called Urban Transformation. RMI is a think, scale, do tank, which is a fancy way of saying that we are an institute that is just as much interested in putting out thought leadership that changes the climate narrative and supports an equitable energy transition, as we are focused on implementation in the climate action space. As a program within RMI, what our geography is cities. We are most interested in supporting local government and community groups in the pieces of the climate action space that's hardest for them to control, but where there's most power. We think about this in terms of the grids that they don't control, but they have a lot of influence over, given that they're huge consumers, how people and goods move, and especially housing. So housing that is both a tool for equity as much as climate action. So I mentioned we're a think, scale, do organization. Everything we do is informed by data. And I'll just say that 30% of US GHGs, greenhouse gas emissions within the US, come from driving alone. So our team estimates that by 2030, we will need 70 million electric vehicles and a 20% reduction in vehicle miles traveled to keep the US within its Paris climate change agreement figures, so 1.5 degree warming. And just want to emphasize that's a pretty powerful figure. It's been about a year since we had a study that came out with that calculus. And the reaction has been kind of all over the place. No one seems to balk at the 70 million electric vehicles. But when it comes to the 20% reduction in how much we drive, it's a lot of back and forth of, well, we can't do that. We just came out of, well, we're still in, but we saw a freeze on how much we drove within the US, and then a return to that figure and a little bit above it as well, now that we have so much of our goods coming directly to our door. And why is that? Because we have a built environment that demands the amount of travel to reach essential destinations. And that's even when 50% of our workforce is not traveling. That's no longer our figure, and inherently inequitable that we have planning policies that demand that, or see that remote work is a core strategy. What we need to do is use land use as a tool for reducing those emissions. So how do we get to 20% less vehicle miles traveled? There's no one solution. The strategies on the right are pulled from another one of our analyses, estimating that vehicle miles traveled reduction can be achieved at the urban scale through pricing signals, street redesign, stopping highway expansions, transportation demand management. The most powerful here is sustainable smart growth. And I'll share more of those figures as well. Where this comes from is an effort within RMI for us to think more about how individuals are consuming emissions as opposed to the systems themselves. We've been leaders in talking about how to decarbonize mobility systems, our buildings, our electricity grid, but those don't see the emissions at the individual level. So we're trying to create a narrative that talks about emissions from an equity standpoint. What does it mean to be able to actually live within a community in a way that you can go about your daily life in a walkable space? You can afford the neighborhoods that are walkable and transit rich. And how do we change that status quo that we currently have within our US cities? So we as a team will be putting out some research within the new year where we put forward a concept of climate aligned housing. And this is two things really. So we know that we need net zero buildings if we're ever going to meet our climate action goals. We know we need to bring down the price of retrofits, especially for low and moderate income households, as a tool for reducing displacement, for keeping people within the communities that they grew up in. But we also need to think about where we're doing our building and create a level of affordability and decarbonization by design, by enabling more types of housing in walkable and transit-rich areas, as well as doing the opposite, commercial rebalancing that brings those mobility and amenities within neighborhoods that people already live. So that calculus is one that we don't think the climate community has been particularly innovative in yet. We've seen these as systems as opposed to integrated opportunities to expand climate action implementation. Just want to show this waterfall chart here of what I referenced. This is at the looking at the urban metro scale for what strategies can be done to reduce VMT, and the logical process that brought us as a program to thinking about land use as a strategy for decarbonization. At the urban scale, we believe a combination of equitable transportation-oriented development, urban infill, enabling missing middle has the power to reduce as much as 20% vehicle miles traveled alone in our urban area. So previewing some maps here that will be the basis of our research coming out in early 2023. We looked at both large spatially and fast growing urban areas where the combination of population growth, not producing enough housing, sprawling development patterns is causing what are, in our own opinion, very ambitious climate action plans at the jurisdiction level of the city to be somewhat negated by the development that is happening outside. And this is at its core an issue of land use. So not enabling, not legalizing as well as supporting missing middle types, housing types, and different types of development, pairing our transportation investments with this new housing forces urban sprawl, displacements, a higher cost of living. And I know I'm not really telling anything new to Cambridge, which is a wonderful place to live and has a wonderful urban form. But at the same time, if we keep our density low, then if we artificially control our housing to not allow more types and to support affordable zoning, then we're going to see that growth happen elsewhere. Something within the climate movement that we're trying to change is an appreciation that if you don't enable development where vehicle miles traveled averages are already low, that growth happens elsewhere. And we need to see this as a whole system. What we think is particularly innovative about this research that we'll be having coming up within 2023 is it sees land use codes for what it means at the GHG scale. There are clear benefits in terms of housing affordability, equity of access, market viability of land use reform. What we think we have with this evidence base is a tool for supporting community groups, advocates, local government officials with understanding what those policies means in terms of growth on a 2030, 2040, and 2050s timescale when we need to be locking in very sustainable land use regulations. So previewing another study we have here, and Zack, who really led on this study, took data from the Cool Climate Labs at the zip code level across the country for where vehicle miles traveled and GHG carbon footprints was lowest in the country, and then saw that within a terms of income distribution. So looking at just, where, so the analysis here is where housing is built can be as impactful to emissions reduction as how it is built and operated. The data points within this building more housing here reflects the opportunity to reduce as much emissions as fully electrifying all new buildings by 2030. So a huge number of just pulling the lever of land use regulations, of allowing more housing in these places. And I will pass to Zack just for a second if he wants to share more on this. I think I allocated about 2 more minutes to talking about the scatter plot. If there's anything you want to share, Zack.
Yeah, and just I guess kind of underlining your point about how a lot of climate plans can kind of miss this. A lot of them are using what's called like a pathways decarbonization analysis, which is something actually I have a lot of experience working on in terms of large scale energy modeling. And it's good for answering questions about power plants and vehicles, but it kind of misses the land use dimension. And it is really bad if you do it just for a city, because what you're basically saying is if your city has lower emissions than the region, but you add population to your city's direct emissions will go up in the way it's usually accounted for. So you actually are entirely missing the fact that allowing more people to live a low emissions lifestyle or context is actually reducing global emissions. And Chris Jones and some of the collaborators at UC Berkeley who made the data set used here, they actually had an updated version that was launched in the New York Times this morning. I'll share the link to that. This allows you to kind of look at all the factors driving household emissions, and population density, housing density is like one of the biggest factors. And because of its impact on how people drive, how much people drive, among other things. And what this graph is saying is that income is a big predictor, but there are places where you have the intersection of high incomes or high opportunity, as well as low carbon emissions. And Cambridge is a great example of something in that bottom right quadrant, where there's that opportunity to have both sort of equity and affordability and climate benefits if you're to allow more building.
Yeah, thank you for that, Zach. Where I'll kind of both begin and end there is, this is a story of emissions, but you guys are housing advocates, and modeling that benefit alone isn't what it takes to create the coalitions that make land use reform happen. Land use reform is a really hard thing for local governments to both understand, to stick their necks out, to take on in terms of policy reform. We need to tell that story, not just in terms of emissions, but multiple benefits. So Zach really kind of already got to this analysis where we're looking at that VMT reduction at the zip code level, in terms of there's a lot of power in enabling more housing in the places that are already low VMT. What I'm slightly more interested in, to be kind of brutally honest about it, is that you need to tell this in terms of housing affordability, transportation, deep equity outcomes, if we're going to enable land use reform to happen in these neighborhoods. Both for the practicality of it and what we have as an ethos for how we go about housing. So just to kind of, apologies for glossing over some of this data, but putting a housing and transportation index on top of the VMT, low VMT neighborhoods, tells a story of where we could really be zeroing in on creating more housing, bringing down the cost of living just by creating more supply. So previewing another piece of our upcoming report on how we solve the housing crisis in partnership with more progressive transportation investments and land use reform. We know that the amount of single family housing that we are currently producing today is pretty unsustainable given where it is happening, how it is fueling sprawl. It's also nowhere near the rate of new development we need given our current housing crisis. So there's both an economic opportunity here as much as there is a carbon action one. What I haven't really talked about yet so much is, what is the kind of housing that we're looking to create? It's not really vastly different than the types of densities that we currently have in low VMT reduction neighborhoods for the vast piece. But it has to be done in many types and many scales. So we're looking into what it takes in terms of mechanisms to see the underutilized lot in terms of what is currently there and what could be there, what it takes to support a homeowner to do that subdivision. This is just a really small example of how we can be thinking about newer housing types, given another piece of data looking at how many amenities are within the neighborhood. There's a huge opportunity just supporting incremental development within those neighborhoods that Zack Scotterblad focuses on, creating an economy scale for smaller businesses, smaller builders, especially women and BIPOC community builders, is a pretty powerful tool for, again, creating equity at the urban scale. One, as local governments just legalize this type of development and incentivize it by creating different zones within their zoning code to support infill is a really powerful tool for realizing this. We are also thinking about how do we influence the national builders who do the 99% of new housing that happens out there to appreciate these policies, become a piece of that coalition. And we'll kind of come back to this maybe through questions, but just want to say that these are the different scales that our research is focusing on. To kind of have a summary here of what this looks like in practice. We are advocating for flexible land use regulations, equitable transportation, equitable transit-oriented development, but we're also thinking about what happens next. Those are the policy mechanisms that I don't have to tell you very much about, because A Better Cambridge has been really effective of putting those policies in place. And I know there's more ambition that you want to do as an organization and as residents in a community that you love. But we also have to be thinking about what comes after that regulation. We know where ambitious land use reform has occurred. It doesn't immediately open the floodgates to permitting requests for missing middle housing at those three scales I just mentioned, the homeowner, the incremental development builder, or the national builder and mega builder. We need to be supporting our labor force to create these types of housing. That goes for the builder, that goes for the labor, because as International Building Code currently stands, many missing middle types trigger a more skilled set of needs. And if we're already looking at a pretty stretched labor market within the construction sector, the assumption is that only about 10% of any given city's labor force is qualified to produce types of housing in any range beyond the single family or that go beyond the stacked three level unit. We as an institute think cities are pretty powerful organizations for supporting that workforce training and doing so equitably. We also see supporting a merchant class and small scale developer class as another thing cities should be taking on as action. This went slightly out of order because I thought that one was more important, but bringing it home a bit to where we started all of this research was just asking the question of what it takes to enable land use reform. This is based on an analysis of several cities and states that have adopted that level of ambition over the last 3 years. There's obviously the Portlands and the Minneapolises, but there's really innovative places like what Memphis has done with their 3.0 plan that tell this story as well. So I don't have to tell you guys how hard adopting land use reform is at the city scale, but for your own success story and the ambition that you're looking to take on further in the next few years, it's a story of 4 strategies in my opinion, and that's telling that story, telling the benefits that are capable when you take on that ambition. In terms of this is the ethos of RMI is being able to model those benefit changes. We have prioritized looking at reducing greenhouse gas emissions with our land use modeling. But we also want to tell it in terms of what this means for market viability, what new housing could possibly come online, given these policy mechanisms. What does this mean for public health and walkability and return on investment to cities who are pretty stretched at the moment, given budgets? That modeling is core to what we as an institute are doing in this space. And we believe that data should be what influences the policy. If I didn't say it already, it should have been my point number 1, that just ending exclusively single family zones is, in my opinion, a minimum action. what it takes to actually realize these new types of housing, to get developers to understand it, to get communities to support it, is many policy changes. Memphis is a really good example where, yes, they took that action of legalizing 4 to 6 units on all single family lots, but they also looked at their building code, their street code, their transportation investments, reforming their fire code, so that there's just pulling back all those other layers without reducing safety, but bringing the cost down so that developers see this as the first type of buildings that they should be prioritizing. Again, this is a bit of a cycle. We've told that story in terms of data, and we've put these policies together. The Big Tent Coalition approach is universal to every land use reform success story, and a Better Cambridge is a great example of that as well. You need to be able to tell the story of land use reform in terms of what it means for several sets of individuals, people who want to age in place, people who want their kids to be able to afford to live in their neighborhood when they're ready to start renting or purchasing on their own. I need to be able to see what this does for reducing displacement in my community, because we know we need a combination of both more supply, funneling that into subsidies, creating a stable system, and that Big Tent Coalition approach is universal. And lastly, we see a core strategy in telling that story of envisioning the change with design. Have a reference here to the city of LA's ADU design challenge Design LA challenge that brought community groups and local designers together to see what I'm blanking on HB. Zach, help me out. Which state bill am I talking about when in California for allowing 2 units on any lot within the state?
Yeah, SB 9.
SB 9. Okay, thank you. So yeah, the story here is anticipating that these policy changes are going to happen as a local government organization is really powerful. It's another way to bring down that lever and make sure the people who are responsible for the vast majority of buildings know what they are going to have to build sooner. And you can tell that story in terms of design challenges, community input sessions. The visualization is another way to build that coalition. So previewing a piece that we'll also be putting out in 2023. We don't think we've done anything particularly new when we talk about what it takes to realize land use reform, where we feel there's more of a gap in terms of research and action and connecting it to the climate community, is saying what it does to actually, what is needed to actually realize it. So working with builders, community organizations to understand what housing typologies have a market need, have a desire from terms of people looking for housing in these VMT, in walkable transit-rich neighborhoods, connecting with the actors who are very powerful, but often not thought of as part of that coalition. Financial institutions, different size developers, especially community builders, showing them the return on investment and the viability of these mixed missing middle housing types, supporting that workforce training that we got into a bit. And again, a design at scale. Cities are really powerful potential Costco's, if you will, for creating putting up front the cost of a lot of these standard designs for missing middle housing. I'm going to pause there, and I apologize that I haven't been able to keep up with the chat, but I think I'm going to even stop sharing my screen and turn this into an opportunity of what pieces of this were most interesting to a Better Cambridge, and where you guys would want to lead this conversation with more.
Hey, Anna, thank you very much for giving the presentation. I think that everyone thought this was really fascinating. And so it's really exciting work that you guys are doing. So I guess as we open up for questions, so if people maybe if people use the raise hands feature, I'll kind of try to go in order that I see you and unmute people. And also we'll try like bring in, there's a bunch of questions in the chat that I'll also try to pull in as well. Maybe just to get us started, a question that I got over email for somebody who couldn't make it today. I guess when you see lots of construction, even in like urban areas like Cambridge, it definitely doesn't look very green. There's lots of noise, like trees get chopped down. It's not great for like habitats for any animals that are still living here. Even though I think that we'd all agree that it is pretty beneficial for the environment to try to improve and increase density inside cities. Can you talk a little bit about what the impact is of increasing building in denser cities relative to like greenfield development out in the suburbs might look like, and maybe not just in a VMT or a greenhouse gas type idea, but even just from a like a habitat type of a point of view?
Yeah, no, that's an awesome question, and I'm pretty forward thinking in terms of how some of our direct support to cities is going to look like in the new year. Telling the story of urban nature and zoning together is really powerful, both as a mechanism for financing the kind of green infrastructure that we need to keep cities livable in a more extreme climate, but also it's sort of this back and forth feature as well. So I don't think it's particularly fair to say that some environmentalists stand in the way of land use reform because it means there's some trees getting cut down and there's going to be construction in your neighborhood. It's definitely true that happens, and kind of what I love about land use at the same time, because it's a really hyper local power, just a point of conversation between different groups. But at the same time, the core of this modeling is that if we don't produce this housing here, we are going to produce, we're going to take away land that is powerful for carbon sequestration, for urban living generally. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought because it's 2 a.m. and I'm really sorry. There does need to be this level of give and take. We are going to lose some trees in the urban environment if we're going to produce as much housing as we need. But it can't be the point at which we say no new housing. Everything is a calculus at the urban scale. And I'd invite Zack to jump into here.
Yeah, I mean, I think from a carbon accounting, it's definitely worth keeping in mind that it's like an order of magnitude bigger to allow people to live in a dense context, where they don't have to drive versus losing a few trees. At the same time, it's kind of a false choice because, to Anna's point, like if the house you're building in the city is in a denser context as maybe saving several times that many trees at the suburban fringe. And from, but like given all of the benefits of trees and how much people like them, and, for environmental coalitions, I think it's important to kind of emphasize like, it's really not a trade-off between trees and housing. Like you can have so many trees, with dense housing. It's really about all the asphalt that we dedicate to cars in the urban context. And that's where we should be focusing the trade-off rather than against housing.
Awesome. I think that was a great answer. I think next up, another question from the chat that was earlier that Alan brought up was that right now Cambridge is talking about a new ordinance that will require like big buildings to retrofit themselves to become more energy efficient. Have you guys seen any other like case studies or examples of how programs like that have worked well, and maybe even also situations where they've worked poorly? So this way, as we think about implementing this in the future, how can we do it the best?
I'm so sorry, PJ. Can you repeat the question? Because you cut out in the middle for me.
Sorry about that. The wonders of Cambridge internet. Basically, so Cambridge right now, we're talking about passing an ordinance that's going to require big buildings to retrofit further to be more energy efficient. And so the key question is, have you like seen examples of places that have done this, and ideally places that have done it well and poorly, so we can try to learn from the best practices?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm giving you a wonderful example because it's an international context, which is slightly unfair to all US cities. But Barcelona's green ordinance is one where it's combining that need for better energy efficiency within our buildings and just an appreciation for how much of our building stock now is going to be our building stock in 50 years. So they're looking at their land use code as a way to incentivize that transition as well. It's both seeing the property in terms of 70% of it needs to have vegetative cover. The unit needs to come to carbon neutral, but also see itself within that one lot. In terms of, sorry, I'm choosing which way I want to go with this question. If zoning is the mechanism for which you try and decarbonize a building, it's probably not the most impactful one. I would say it comes down to engaging who owns that building. Because yes, you can put fines on it, and a lot of cities who are trying to get that level of ambition out of building owners go about that strategy. From our own calculus within RMI and seeing the buildings that are quote unquote dirty buildings now, they're not dirty because the owner wants them to be. It's because they haven't been able to prioritize those retrofitting systems. So I would say that cities are a really strong tool for creating that lowering the costs upfront of the kind of clean strategies, clean instruments that we should be putting into our buildings. That goes for training them, training the installers, the building owners, creating modeling mechanisms that show them their savings over time. Those are the strategies that we put forward, as opposed to the punitive, but there should be punitive too.
Fair enough. Yeah, thank you. I think that's a good answer. Camilla's got your hand. You have your hand raised. Do you have a question?
Yes, thank you guys so much for taking the time. And gosh, at 2 a.m. I had no idea. Thank you. So I think this is, I guess, one question I have wondered about as someone who works in the recycling world, and also uses housing policy as my primary form of climate activism, is how do you guys think about, and this is something that has come up in conversations in Cambridge, it's not like a key point, but it does come up, is how do you think about the embodied carbon and the embodied energy in housing that gets either demolished or deconstructed, and to be more energy efficient, more dense housing in the future. And also this, I don't know if you know anything about this, but I know that Portland, Maine has a deconstruction, not Maine, Portland, Oregon, the deconstruction program instead of demolition. And in Massachusetts, there's a small coalition looking into that. And I'm concerned about the cost impacts. So that was a lot. You can drop the last part. But basically, what's the calculus on embodied energy and carbon in existing houses versus rebuilding them?
Yeah, I know Zach's going to want to say something here, but I'll say my piece a little bit before he jumps in and has a more informed answer. I think all of this is a point of being able to look at the asset in terms of what it means to the owner. Plenty of property owners are obviously not going to want to redevelop their unit, even though they are a climate advocate and they know that they could be reducing emissions by subdividing their lot. Everything has to be seen from a level of at what point does this 70-year-old single family unit on a like 2-acre property equate to an opportunity for redevelopment. So within our incoming land use report, we mainly focus on underutilized commercial properties for housing development, given, we don't build enough housing now as it is. There's a lot of things we can do to be incentivizing it. But given what market actors are and what the current supply chain is, we're only going to see so much building in the next few years anyway. So if we can just focus on these transportation corridors and help private developers and public developers and community builders to see them as that first point, then we can kind of do all of those things a little bit more while still leaving the space for, some single family homes will be redeveloped and should be if we're going to have more equitable, inclusive places. So Zach, you can go now. So.
Yeah. I think in some ways this is kind of like the tree question, where sometimes people bring up like an edge case. All other things being equal, reusing existing buildings is better for embodied carbon than like demolishing and rebuilding the same building in place. There may, sometimes that helps you build it more efficient, and over a long enough time that might pencil out in terms of carbon. But like really the question is, if it's a choice between housing like 10 families and 1 family in that building, and those 9 families were otherwise going to require you to build 9 new buildings somewhere else, it's clearly a winner to have more compact development. And there are some studies that actually look at filling our housing demand with historical patterns of mostly single family homes versus building more multifamily, and it actually reduces the embodied carbon to go with more multifamily housing. And on top of that, there's a lot of new ideas about how to reduce embodied carbon in new buildings using like cross-laminated timber and kind of advanced forms of low carbon concrete that you can also incentivize.
Awesome, thank you. Those are, I think, a bunch of very thorough and very good answers. I think Bill Beam has a question that he wants to ask.
Hi, thank you guys so much for this excellent presentation. My question coming partly from my, I'm an architect and I try to help people visualize things, and I saw and heard you mention something about visualization. I saw some glimpses of some interesting modeling, I think, in your presentation. And one of the challenges that we have is kind of spinning out visualizations of different housing scenarios. It's one thing to kind of to kind of model the way things are. And then it's quite another to say, well, if we pull this zoning lever, here's what could happen. Or if we restrict it over there, here's what might happen. Are you doing anything like that? Or have you heard of any sort of such modeling techniques?
It's a really cool idea. I would say there's a lot of organizations that are doing it on a micro scale. I don't think we've created a place for that as a scalable system exists. Obviously, there's a lot of builders who specialize in producing accessory dwelling unit models that are pretty cookie cutter. We're getting to a, in my opinion, positive place where building inspectors, planners appreciate and can just give approval to these design types off the bat. But I don't think, granny flats are even if they were everywhere, are going to be how we reduce our housing shortage, unfortunately. What I definitely want to see in the space is a movement of builders who appreciate the economies of scale of infill development. So being able to pull all those tools in the toolbox together, prefab where it's possible, and creating those systems and bringing those jobs into cities so that it's happening, and in a place where that it becomes the coalition as well, using workforce development to know how to build those designs at the level to create it quickly, but without losing quality.
Thanks.
Alan?
Alan has a question. Oh, yes.
Hi, thanks so much. This was one of the, I think Greg from Denver alluded to this, and you talked about this a little bit in the chat, but I'm really curious about, you can talk if you can talk about kind of the spectrum of kind of high density to low density, near transit, far from transit, right? Like we all know that that it's more exciting to get more housing really close to transit. But one of the things I always like to say about Cambridge is that every single spot in Cambridge is less than half a mile from a transit stop. And so when we talk about prioritizing housing near transit, that's all of Cambridge. And I saw in the chat there was mention of even, in drivable, in non-walkable but somewhat drivable neighborhoods, more density can mean people drive less. So can you comment a little bit about how do you prioritize, or how do you talk about the different levels of scale that might be appropriate in different environments in order to affect the kinds of transformation we need?
That's a really cool question. And I apologize for not making the slides a little more focused to Cambridge situation, where I think we often reference, a city like Austin or Denver where people still have cars. They come to the city with cars. They come to the city without cars from places in California and Cambridge, and they buy cars. But there's plenty of these places out there like Cambridge where you get that opportunity to see how you can live without it. I would say where the most power is for equitable climate action is looking at the fast growing cities that don't appreciate that they could be shifting their mobility investments and their land use reform in ways that support living without a car. But we didn't give any of our analysis on micromobility or how our program is supporting local governments to shift some of their state appropriated dollars in terms of what has the most decarbonization tool. But to your question, it's not really enough for me to look just at the vehicle miles traveled average, even though in a place like Cambridge, it's really powerful, that it's a very low rate. I would say what is missing to take a state like Massachusetts, where everything is seen from the perspective of the T and rapid buses. We're missing the transportation deserts that are connected to those places, and asking the question of why there are transportation deserts. Is it because there's not enough housing there to begin with, so we're not creating the user base, and we're not giving cities the tools they need to see the opportunity in more housing to create a public transportation user base if we just increase that frequency and the service.
Yeah, I can also expand on some of the stuff I was talking about in the chat. And this is a conversation that comes up a lot in the Bay Area too. Like San Francisco, similarly, our planning commission is like doing different scenarios where they try to optimize housing around transit corridors. But like if you look at some of these maps of VMT, you can see it in the cool climate maps, like all of San Francisco is a transit corridor, compared to like the regional or the national average. And I do think there are some kind of unresolved questions about if there's any trade-off between like if you just wanted to like minimize emissions and had no other criteria, just like put everyone in like a tower right on top of a train station, but in terms of like opening up exclusive communities to more diverse kinds of households, and just the practicality of kind of meeting people where they are, you need to have that whole spectrum. And I think sometimes the sort of professionalized kind of environmental, or the advocates of kind of like smart growth, I think historically have kind of overly indexed to these like kind of perfect, transit oriented scenarios, and missed that just like allowing people to incrementally build more densely and more walkable in, over the much larger area of existing communities has a big role to play.
Thanks.
Awesome. David, do you have a question you'd like to ask? You need to unmute. Let me. Here, let me.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think we can unmute for him.
Do you want to drop your question in the chat?
Is this
Yeah,
work
David.
now? Yeah.
Type it in the
Okay.
chat. I'll read. Oh, there you go. You got it.
Yeah, I'm going. Do you know of any urban regions where surrounding townships have developed a coalition of housing advocacy groups that work together?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Abundant, Massachusetts is a great example of pulling from many local advocate groups to be able to create a common voice for what kind of ambitious land use reform both their local jurisdictions and the state should be adopting in a given legislative calendar year. But just to give
did you just name a group?
Abundant Housing Massachusetts.
Oh, okay.
Which I think Alan and PJ, you guys coordinate with quite a little bit. Sorry, I've got too many examples that I can't get them out of my mouth. So in the Portland example, Neighbors for More Neighbors is a cohesion group of pulling from many different organizations looking at not just for land use ambition out of their city, but other policy changes. It's a really good example of that big tent where not everyone is coming to the table asking for land use reform for the sake of housing and equity or carbon action. You have to tell the story in terms of multiple benefits and create that common narrative that picks the things that could happen now. Desegregate Connecticut is another wonderful semi-local example to you guys of one leader that pulls 96 organizations together to come up with a cohesive vision for what the state government is going to take on within 1 year.
Would you be able to post some of these on your website as a list?
Yeah,
Yes,
absolutely. We'll send out. Oh yeah, we'll. Sorry to cut you off on it. Yeah, we'll absolutely send it out as an email. Some links to these afterwards, David, so you can look to get involved.
and Zack is California. There's kind of too many to name, so I avoided it. But another really good example of a huge geography, a huge amount of ambitious cities trying to pull in less ambitious cities, both through what the state demands now in terms of housing ambition, as well as leader cities pulling in their less ambitious neighbors.
Yeah, there's some really interesting political dynamics in California too. Like right now, like in San Francisco, for instance, the citywide elected officials and state legislators from San Francisco have kind of sided with building more housing, whereas a lot of the city council that's kind of represents smaller areas that are kind of more subject to NIMBY pressures are against it. And so there's sort of this coalition of like some of San Francisco along with the statewide legislators and movements trying to get like the rest of San Francisco to move along. So and there's also, if you look at what's gotten through the state legislature, there's been really interesting coalitions of like agricultural and rural districts along with like very urban districts kind of opposing some of the exclusive suburban districts and people that are actually voting for some of these zoning reforms.
Awesome. That does take us to the hour, and so I think maybe that's a good place to call it. Thank you so much, Anna and Zach. This was a really wonderful presentation, and I think everybody learned something today. For everybody else who's still on the call, I'm going to send out both a summary of all of this, and we'll try to post a recording of this on our website or give everybody access as well. And then on top of that, we're going to send out a survey. We want to hear back from everyone here. What worked well? What did you learn? And what we can do better for making engaging events for everybody. So I don't know if anyone wants to unmute themselves. We can do the whole applause thing over Zoom, which is always a little. I want to best we click the buttons.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Have a good night, everyone.
Alrighty, take care.